Let me get started and tell you what I'd like to do today. I thought I would do a few things. First, let me talk about where the economy is right now, how we got here, and then tell you a little bit about where I think we're going. And then what I'd like to do really is open it up for a good bit of discussion, because I know many of you have questions about some of the things that we did, some of the things we didn't do, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to be able to ask some of those questions, and I'll do my best to give you straight answers on them. All right, well, let's look at the current situation right now and ask where we are and how did we get here. Well, first of all, let me start by saying, despite what you may have heard, this is not the worst economy since the Great Depression. The current unemployment rate is a little over 8%, certainly nothing to be happy about, but we reached levels that were close to 11% in the recession of 82 and 83, and we could certainly get to those levels. We hope we don't get to those levels, but we're not there at this point. So we'll have to see how things develop over the next year or so before we conclude that this is the worst set of economic circumstances that we've been in. What I think we can say, however, is that this is the worst financial crisis that we have seen since the Great Depression. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And that has had an impact on the real economy that only started very recently. Most of the financial sector turmoil was really confined to that sector pretty much until September, and in September the economy took a very significant dive downward as things spilled over into the real sector. And the easiest way to see that is to look at the jobs numbers. If you look at job loss before September, what you saw was job losses in the neighborhood of 100 to 150,000 per month. Again, nothing to be happy about, but after that, job losses went up to around 500,000 per month, and now they're in the 600,000, 650,000 range. So we saw a qualitative shift in the way the economy was behaving about last September, and I'm going to try to talk about how that happened, why that came about. Most of the people who have looked at the financial crisis and have thought about it have the following conclusion. And again, this is one of the nice things about being back at Stanford and being in a place like SIEPR and Hoover and graduate school business, is that you have the opportunity to think about data over longer periods. When you're at the Council of Economic Advisors, a long period is a week. When you're an academic, a long period is something like 100 years. So that's a luxury that I'm getting anxious to take advantage of in the near future. But at least at this point, I would say the best thinking on what happened is that we switched from being in a situation where developing countries were being net users to net suppliers of capital. And the way that we can best see that is if you look at this chart up here, what you'll see is that in 1996, we had the industrial countries were very slight lenders to the rest of the world, and that completely reversed. By 2007, you see that the developing countries were lending significantly to the developed countries. That's kind of unusual, because if you think about that, usually you lend when you're relatively wealthy in your lifetime, and you borrow when you're relatively poor. That's why you borrow when you're a graduate student, and you lend later on in life. You don't usually lend when you're a graduate student. Well, the Chinese are like graduate students right now, and they are lending to the United States at very significant rates. So what that did as an empirical matter is that it caused the credit spreads to shrink. Now, what we mean by credit spreads shrinking is that the difference between the rates that were paid on high-risk activities versus the rates that were paid on low-risk activities went down. That difference went down. And you can see that on the chart by looking at, say, for example, the spread on junk bonds, which took a dramatic decline from 2003 to 2007, and it fell quite significantly during that period, which meant that it was cheaper to finance risky investments. The epicenter of those risky investments in the United States was the residential housing market. And that showed up in very large increases in the amount of capital flowing into housing. And as a result, what we saw was a large increase in housing starts over that period. So when you look at the peak in 2007, housing starts were about 2.2 million per year. That's considerably up from the average, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 1.5 million per year. So we were building about 700,000 houses above what we would normally do in a typical year. So after a while, you keep doing that, you get to a situation where the supply builds up relative to the demand, and we know from our basic economics that when supply is greater than demand, it puts downward pressure on prices, and of course that's what we saw. Now, part of this was associated with some of the lending practices, and of course we all know about the boom in subprime. Turns out, if you look at the data, subprime expansion is not a new phenomenon. It actually started back in the 90s. So subprime expansion went up fivefold between 1993 and 1998, and then went up a little more than double again between 2001 and 2005. And this was a prolonged development. But subprime was just one aspect of the high-risk credit ventures that were engaged in during that period. Now, just let me pause on that for a moment, because people in retrospect look back at this and they say, how could anybody in their right minds have loaned money to individuals that were in these subprime categories? It just didn't make any sense. In hindsight, that's true. But if you think about it and put it in the context of the time, remember that subprime loans carried with them much higher interest rates than prime loans, than conforming loans. And the question was whether those higher yields were sufficient to compensate for the risk. Now, it turns out, of course, after the fact, we know that they weren't sufficient to compensate for the risk. But none of the lenders who were making those loans at the time thought that these individuals who were getting those loans had the same default probabilities as others. What unfortunately ended up happening was it turned out that the default probabilities were significantly higher than we expected them to be. And I think that was in large part a result of the decline in housing prices that came about because of what I talked about earlier, which was the surplus of building over the amount of demand that we had. So if you look at this chart, there are two different indexes of housing prices there, and depending on which one you use, you get slightly different dates of the start in the decline and also different intensities of the decline. But the basic point, I think, is clear, and that is that housing prices were falling, and when housing prices fell, that placed pressure on the ability of financial institutions to refinance loans. And that's pretty much what caused this whole thing to happen, because lenders who felt that they would be in situations where they would be easily able to refinance their loans from these risky borrowers were suddenly unable to do so. All right, well, the decline in housing prices then uncovered problems that were caused by these mortgage excesses in other areas as well. And an expression that I like, I heard it from Warren Buffett, but I'm sure others have said it as well, which is when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. And that's what happened. So the tide went out, and it exposed a lot of practices that we thought were safe and we thought were conservative, turned out not to be so safe and conservative. And that caused what we think of as the credit crunch, which started in August of 2007. The problem that we have right now is that we went from a situation of being drunk and all of us feeling the hangover to the current situation where lenders aren't even willing to drink water anymore. So we have a problem in that people have become overly conservative and not overly reckless. The issue is not that we're seeing behavior that is inconsistent with long-run conservative growth, but rather we're seeing behavior that is inconsistent with short-run investment and expansion of the economy. During this period, we also saw that the distinction between liquidity and solvency vanished. And we usually make that distinction. Solvency, of course, means that the firm has sufficient assets to cover its liabilities. Liquidity simply means that those assets can be turned into money pretty quickly. So, for example, you can own a very expensive house, the value of which easily covers your liabilities, but it's an illiquid asset. It takes a long time to sell a very expensive house, and so you can't turn that into dollars. Well, what happened in the Bear Stearns case was that a situation that we thought was one of solvency and merely one of illiquidity turned into one of insolvency. And the reason for that was that when firms had calls on their assets and they could not quickly turn those assets into dollars that they could then pay off to their creditors, they were forced into a fire sale environment. And in that fire sale environment, those assets that previously were above the value of the liabilities immediately fell in value and became short of the value sufficient to cover the liabilities. So what you had as a liquidity crisis then turned into a solvency crisis. That's where we were with Bear Stearns. All right, well, that was back almost a year ago now. And at that time, we thought that things could easily be repaired, or not easily, but could be repaired by dealing with that situation kind of on a one-off basis. What ended up happening was, after a while, we realized that the situation was one of popcorn and not of dominoes. And let me explain that to you. Here's what I mean by popcorn and dominoes. If you think about dominoes, in the domino situation, if you knock one domino, then of course all the others fall. But if you're able to keep that one primary domino from toppling all the others, then you've saved the whole problem. You saved the whole situation. In popcorn, let's suppose that one kernel pops, and you know it's going to pop. So you grab it and you quickly get it out of the pot. Well, that doesn't prevent the other kernels from popping because the heat is still there, and the basic cause, the underlying cause of the problem, in this case, in the popcorn problem, is that the pot is getting too hot. Now, they may pop at different rates, depending on the idiosyncrasies of each kernel, depending on where they happen to be in the frying pan, but they're going to pop because the underlying factor that's causing the problem is still there. It took us a while to discover that, I think. And when I say us, I'm speaking as us in the government, but I also think that's true of the business community and also of the economic community. We weren't quite sure whether this was a contagion model, a domino kind of model, or whether this was what I think of as a common factors model, which is a popcorn model. And it took us all a while to kind of work through that. But by September, we became pretty confident, at least within the government, that we were in a popcorn situation and that we had to deal with this in a much more systematic way in order to alleviate the problem. We simply couldn't deal with one firm at a time. And I think the best evidence of that was Bear Stearns didn't do the trick. We fixed Bear Stearns. If that was the domino, why did we have these others falling later? So we had it in 1 week, of course. We had Fannie and Freddie, we had AIG, we had Lehman. You had, at that point, runs on the banks, shortly followed with Washington Mutual, Wachovia. You had breaking the buck in money markets. Interbank lending was down. Commercial paper issuance was almost at zero in certain sectors. And so things were pretty bad. In fact, we were very, very worried that we were at the edge of a cliff. And so the question was, what do we do at that point? And so the determination was made that it was necessary to get money and make sure that that money got into the financial sector. And initially, as you well remember, it was called the TARP, Troubled Assets Repurchase Program. And the idea was to purchase troubled assets. But that took a variety of forms, and we were aware that some flexibility might be needed in terms of how that program would actually be run. So we were careful in making sure that the legislation allowed sufficient leeway for the administration, in particular the Department of Treasury, to have that leeway as they implemented the TARP. I would say, and I know that the TARP has received a lot of criticism, but I would argue that the TARP has been an enormous success. And the evidence that the TARP has been an enormous success is that the situation today, while still problematic, is very different from the situation that we faced back in September and October. If you look at the LIBOR rates, for example, the interbank rates that we see, they reached almost 7% at the end of September. That was a pretty scary period. They're now back down to what we would think of as normal range, very close to the Fed funds rate. So interbank lending is back up. Commercial paper issuance is now up dramatically above even the pre-September levels in the non-financial sector. There are no runs on banks. There are no runs on money markets, no breaking the buck. And so all of the things that we were worried about at that time, those problems have been alleviated. Now, obviously, other problems remain. There is still tightness in credit markets. Mortgage rates are down, but that's true primarily for conforming loans. On the jumbo loans, there are still pretty high rates. This is not an environment in where it's easy to get cash. Last night, we talked a little bit about debtor in possession financing, in the context of some of the auto firms as they think about whether they should declare Chapter 11 or not. I'm sure you've seen that in the press. And that's not readily available either. So there are certainly problems out there. But I would argue that the TARP was successful in dealing with some of the problems that we had. Let me just talk about a couple more issues, and then I'll stop. One of the things we had to do in September was deal with Fannie and Freddie, and the approach that we took was to put Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. Now, conservatorship, of course, means that they are supposed to come out of that status. And the question is how and when. And there are a few models for that, and I'm just going to list them, and if people are interested, you can ask me in the discussion period. There are basically four approaches that people have talked about. One is to liquidate Fannie and Freddie, basically put them out of business and never see them again. A second is to sell insurance to Fannie and Freddie, but also to sell that same kind of insurance by the government to all other private institutions that would like to securitize mortgages as well. A third is a public utility model, and a fourth is to nationalize the mortgage industry basically altogether. And I have my preferences on that. As I said, if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about that. I think the reality is right now liquidation is not a viable model simply because for reasons that we all understand at this point, Fannie and Freddie do basically run the mortgage market. They are the mortgage market, and it would be a very difficult and shocking blow to the economy if we were to pull them out. So we have to deal with that in a slightly less draconian way. Stimulus. How about the stimulus? We actually looked at this. Back in December, we knew that the Obama administration was going to initiate a stimulus, second stimulus. We had one as well, but the second stimulus. And the question was, if they're going to do it, we're already in a recession anyway, why not do it right now? Why not beat them to the punch? Might as well get started on it. And when we looked at it, our view was that it is very difficult to spend significant amounts of money in a short period of time. It's not so easy to do. And one of my staff members put it in terms of a movie that I have not seen, but maybe some of you have. It was apparently a Richard Pryor movie called Brewster's Millions, where a guy is given like $30 million or something, and the requirement is he has to spend it within a month, and then he can get another $300 million. And the problem is to spend this $30 million, and it turns out it's not so easy to do that. All right, there are some constraints on him. It's not so easy to do that. Well, we found we were in a Brewster's Millions situation, that it was just very difficult to get out more than about $400 billion in a short period of time. And what I mean by short is a period of time sufficiently relevant to make it an actual stimulus. So that was our view of it, and as a result, we decided that we would simply wait and allow the Obama administration that was coming in to tailor things in the way that they best thought would work. But just to give you an example of this, the transportation numbers, everybody talks about infrastructure, roads, for example. Two problems with that. One is If you look at the Department of Transportation data, what you find is that for any expenditure authorized to the Department of Transportation, you get about 25% of it spent during the first year. It's a flow, it's not a stock. It spends out slowly because you're basically hiring labor and buying supplies, and you can only do that as fast as you're building roads, and it just takes time to do that. So you can't get it out all that quickly. The second thing is it's narrow. It's targeted at a very specific part of the labor force. In this case, not just construction, but a narrow part of construction. And so that's the big problem with doing it. It's not easy to get that kind of money out in a way that's consistent with it being an economic stimulus. All right, what would be good to do? Well, my view is that as we go forward, we should continue to capitalize the financial sector. I think that the evidence from history and from other countries is that's the best recipe for a turnaround. If we look at countries like Japan, if we look at Sweden, if we look at Korea, if we look at Mexico, when they were able to infuse capital into the financial sector, that's when they started to get things under control. The ability to purchase assets, which we shifted from, I think is limited. We calculated at one point that we had about $3 trillion of assets that one could regard as high-risk assets, high-default assets, where default is something with over a 20% probability of experiencing a default. $3 trillion is a lot of money. It's hard to buy up $3 trillion worth of assets, and that was the reason that if you took $350 billion, buy up 10% of that market, you have a pretty small impact on what that situation is going to be. But that's not true if you inject capital into those sectors. If you give capital to these institutions under the terms that we did in the TARP, which I think were actually pretty well designed, I believe that it can have an effect, and I would continue to push that. Second, I would argue for real and permanent tax cuts. I'm still a big fan of tax cuts. I think that's the right way to go, and I do think they have to be permanent. I like the investment tax credit approach that the Obama administration has in there. We use that as well. I think that's effective, but I would like to see that in the long run. I believe in full expensing of capital. I think that's healthy for the economy and also healthy for the tax structure. And I also think it would be good to push for lower capital gains and dividends taxes. I think the evidence from the 2003 cuts is pretty compelling in terms of its effect on behavior, and I think that would go in the right direction. And then finally, I think we need to make sure that we continue to push for a free trade environment. The evidence, again, from other countries and other periods, the Great Depression being the most obvious one, is that moving in the direction of isolationism is not helpful to a struggling economy. So the final message. I think this is a system that obviously is under stress right now, but it does work well. The economy will rebound, and I don't believe it's because of government action, either our government, the one I was associated with, or the Obama administration. I think it's just going to rebound because the American economy is resilient. We had 3 years of housing market decline, and until only very recently did that turn into a significant economic downturn. We're able to withstand shocks. When they accumulate, when they come from all directions, we're going to suffer an economic downturn as we did right now, but that will end and we will turn it around. I also believe that we'll do better than other countries. I think that we will come out of this more rapidly than other countries. Japan, Germany, UK are down and down significantly. Korea is down very significantly. I think we'll turn it around more rapidly than they do. And as a result, I'm optimistic. I think it's just a question of how long that it will take. But my view is that it's not that the markets have failed to regulate themselves. Again, I would argue that if anything, they've done so almost too effectively. The private market is ruthless in punishing shareholders and even some unscrupulous CEOs that have behaved inappropriately. But I think it will take some time for us to get back on track. The market will correct it. But the government programs that we've enacted are likely to receive the credit. So let me stop there and open it up for questions and comments. Thank you.